Hola, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
Another family photo, another caption about those who stick together. I smiled for the camera, held my cousin's baby for just long enough to appear nurturing, and nodded along while my Aunt Carla gave her usual speech about gratitude and unity, all while my brother Ethan whispered that I looked like I needed Botox in the group shot. I stood there thinking about how much the whole thing felt like a hostage video. So I did something, not impulsively, but intentionally. I walked back to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and scheduled the billboard I'd designed 3 nights earlier after a sleepless flight home from Seoul. That image had sat in my drafts for weeks, taunting me with a truth I wasn't ready to post. Until now. It was just 3 lines, stark white on black. Forbes 30 under 30, too busy for fake traditions. I chose the billboard on Highway 12, right next to Grandma Rose's house. Now it would have been one thing if it had been tucked away on some side street or out near the lake. But this was the road every one of them took to Sunday brunch, the route to the church where they paraded their togetherness like some sort of moral currency. That thing went up the morning of our annual Sinclair Sunday supper, which was basically a potluck performance of our perfect little dynasty, complete with matching sweaters and a roast Grandma never let anyone else cook. I showed up late wearing jeans and a blazer instead of the embroidered apron Grandma gave me when I was 15. Carla saw me first, lips tight, eyes scanning like a hawk, and then she said it real loud for everyone to hear. Well, if it isn't Miss Too Busy. Nobody laughed. Not even Ethan, who usually lives for watching me squirm. Grandma Rose didn't say anything at first. She just hugged me, smiled tight, and led me inside like I hadn't just lit a match on 50 years of staged togetherness. It wasn't until after dessert, when everyone sat around the fire talking about who would host Easter, that it really started. My phone buzzed over and over, mentions, tags, people sending photos of the billboard. Distant cousins who hadn't texted me in years suddenly wanted to know if I was okay. Uncle Frank was the first to say something out loud, putting his brandy down like it physically hurt him and asking, "Is that real? Did you actually pay for that?" I just sipped my water, smiled, and said nothing. Grandma stood up. You could hear her bones pop. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "We make space for each other, Avery. That's what family does. If you don't want to be part of this, that's fine, but don't tear it down for the rest of us." The silence after that felt thicker than the pie crust. And I almost said something then, almost defended myself, but I couldn't. Not because I felt guilty, but because I knew that anything I said would be twisted into another headline in the family group chat. I excused myself, went upstairs to the guest room, and stared out the window at the church steeple. My hands were still shaking, even though I'd done it on purpose. I thought I'd feel clean, vindicated, but I felt something else. Like I'd cracked a glass I wasn't ready to throw away. When I came back down, most of them had left, except for Ethan and Grandma. He was helping her fold napkins. She wouldn't look at me. She asked if I'd be staying the night or driving back to the city. I told her I had a flight in the morning. She nodded, still not meeting my eyes. Then Ethan smirked and said, "Don't forget your billboard selfie. I'm sure your investors will love that family engagement." I could have slapped him. Instead, I just picked up my keys, told Grandma I'd call her tomorrow, and walked out. It was only when I got home that I noticed the voicemail. Mom. Her voice sounded stiff, controlled. She said Grandma was more upset than she let on, that I should think about the bigger picture, about how Grandpa wouldn't have wanted this. And that's when I saw it. The urn. I hadn't noticed it before, tucked near the bookshelf in the corner of the living room. Grandma had brought it over after the funeral, wanting him to watch over me while I was too busy to come visit. Only now it had a hairline crack running right through the middle. And that's when it hit me. Somebody had dropped it, recently, maybe during a visit, maybe tonight, maybe it had fallen when Grandma brought it to make a point, only to realize I wasn't coming back. And something about that crack, the way it cut right through his name, Robert Sinclair, 1939 to 2021, felt like more than an accident. I stood there for a long time, watching the light from the window hit the edge of the urn just right. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I realized I hadn't really thought about Grandpa in months. Not since the funeral, when everyone told me I looked too strong for someone who'd lost her favorite person. And maybe I had. Maybe that billboard wasn't about the family at all. Maybe it was about him. Or maybe it was about something none of them knew yet. Something I'd found out that night after his wake. Something that had shattered the perfect picture long before I ever touched a billboard. And that's where the real story starts. The Monday after the billboard went up, I woke to 3 voicemails, 7 text messages, and a direct message from the local pastor's wife, which, in our town, carried the weight of a legal summons. I sat in my apartment, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, watching the early morning fog roll off the skyline through my floor-to-ceiling windows. And for a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like if none of them ever called again. If silence was the final consequence, I could live with that. But I should have known better. My family wasn't known for their restraint, especially not when public image was at stake, and especially not when one of their own had embarrassed them in a way they couldn't control. It was Mom who called again first, this time with that particular mix of sharpness and practiced empathy she'd perfected from years of managing both PTA drama and silent suburban betrayals. She said I owed my grandmother an apology, that people were talking, that Rose hadn't gone to church on Sunday for the first time in over a decade, and that maybe, just maybe, it would be a good idea to reframe the narrative before the gossip made it worse. I asked her if she was worried about Grandma's feelings or just her own reputation at the Rotary Club, and for a few seconds, there was only the kind of silence that makes you wonder if the line's gone dead. Then she sighed and said, "You don't understand the pressure she's under," which in my family was code for shut up and play nice. Instead of responding, I hung up, slipped on a hoodie, and made my way to the attic of my apartment building. I knew what I was looking for before I got there, and I knew exactly where it would be. A dusty plastic bin marked Sinclair 2001, 2008, full of old photo albums Grandma had insisted I keep after college, supposedly because I was the one who cared about stories. Back then, I thought it was a compliment. Now I knew it was a trap. I flipped through album after album, Christmas dinners where the smiles looked just a little too rehearsed, 4th of July barbecues where the men drank too much and the women pretended not to notice, birthday parties where every gift was followed by an obligatory photo for the family scrapbook. And then I found it. Tucked between Easter of 2005 and Thanksgiving of 2006, there was a photo I didn't remember seeing before. Grandpa standing next to a woman who wasn't Grandma. She was pretty, younger than him by at least 20 years, and dressed in a way that didn't scream family dinner. They were laughing, like genuinely laughing, leaning close in that way that says intimacy more than any caption could. The photo was printed on slightly different paper, glossier, like it came from a 1-hour photo outside the usual chain. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was innocent, trying to justify it the way my family always justified things they didn't want to confront. But then I noticed the timestamp in the corner, August 14th, 2006, the exact date of Grandma and Grandpa's 40th anniversary party, the one where Grandpa had to leave early for work, the one where we all toasted to love and longevity while Grandma opened a gift that made her cry. I'd thought they were happy tears. Now I wasn't so sure. I slid the photo into my pocket, closed the album, and for the first time since that billboard went up, I felt something more than anger. I felt nauseous. I felt betrayed. And I felt vindicated. Later that night, I drove back to the old house, the one where I grew up, where Mom and Dad still lived and pretended the world hadn't changed. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I just walked in through the side door like I used to, past the framed family crests and the ceramic angel collection, into the kitchen where Mom was slicing lemon bars, as if nothing in the world had changed. She jumped when she saw me, then tried to recover with a too-quick smile. "Decided to come home?" she asked. "No," I said, holding up the photo. I came to ask what you know about this." Her face paled in a way I'd never seen before. Not when Grandma fell and broke her hip. Not when Ethan totaled Dad's truck. Not even when she found out I was leaving law school to launch a startup. She didn't reach for the photo. She didn't even look directly at it. She just walked past me to the sink and turned on the water, her back to me, her hands shaking slightly as she rinsed the knife she hadn't finished using. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "So it's real?" I asked. "She wasn't just some coworker." "I don't know who she was," she said, which was a lie, obviously. "But your grandmother does, and it's not your business to dig that up." I felt like I'd been punched in the throat, not because of the affair itself. I wasn't naive, but because of the way she said it. Like it was her job to protect the image, not the truth. Like I was the one breaking something sacred just by asking. I left without another word, got in my car and drove. Not back to the city, not anywhere in particular, just far enough to think. And that's when I decided if they wanted to play the keep-up appearances game, then I'd play it better. I'd play it smarter. I knew someone who owed me a favor, someone with access to more than just photo albums. And if this was going to be a war of stories, I was going to find the real one. Even if it meant burning every scrapbook along the way. Because if Grandma Rose wanted tradition, then maybe it was time to show her what the truth really looked like when you put it on display. The day after I left my parents' house with that photo still burning a hole in my coat pocket, I sat in my office, a quiet corner of the converted warehouse we called headquarters, surrounded by whiteboards filled with diagrams and projections, digital sticky notes with deadlines and buzzwords, and the distant hum of 20-somethings who thought the world could be redesigned through the right interface. And I stared at my monitor like it was supposed to give me answers about how to reconcile a legacy that now felt like a house of cards built on shame and denial. Cole, my co-founder and the closest thing I had to a real partner in both business and maybe more than business, stopped by my desk, leaned his elbow on the edge like he always did when he was concerned, but didn't want to say it outright, and asked if I was finally coming to that dinner with the investor group on Friday, the one I dodged twice already by pretending to have scheduling conflicts I hadn't actually checked. I told him maybe, which he translated to no, but he let it slide because he could see that something was different, and he had the emotional intelligence not to push too hard when he saw the hard line in my jaw and the way I kept turning my phone face down. What I didn't tell him, not yet anyway, was that I had spent the morning calling in a favor from someone I met during a contract dispute 2 years earlier. A woman named Melissa ran a niche investigations firm that specialized in corporate background checks and discreet personal surveillance for high-net-worth clients who wanted dirt without drama. I told her I needed information on Robert Sinclair, deceased, and any aliases, financial accounts, or known associates between the years of 1998 and 2008. I didn't tell her why, because people like Melissa never ask those questions directly. She just said, "Give me 72 hours," and hung up. Those 3 days stretched like taffy, every hour dragging a new weight behind it. I kept up appearances at the office, signed off on marketing briefs, nodded along in product meetings, but my mind was never more than a breath away from that photo, from the way my mother's shoulders had slumped under the weight of her own complicity, and from the voicemail I got from Grandma Rose midweek that simply said, "Avery, please don't do anything you can't undo." She didn't cry and she didn't beg, but it was the closest she'd ever come to asking me not to ruin her. And that's when I realized. She knew. She had always known. When Melissa finally called back, her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, like even she wasn't used to what she found. She said my grandfather had maintained a separate bank account through a credit union in upstate New York, opened in a different name, Richard Sandler, with deposits that didn't match his reported income, and that for almost a decade, someone named Jane Caldwell had been receiving monthly transfers labeled consulting. I asked for an address. She gave me one. It was less than 2 hours from our family's summer cabin. I didn't hesitate. I left the office, told Cole I had a family thing, technically true, and drove straight there, barely stopping for gas. The address led to a modest two-story home with peeling paint and wind chimes that jingled like something out of a slower, quieter world. A woman answered the door who looked familiar in the way that made your stomach tighten with recognition, like seeing an actor out of costume. She was older now, mid-60s, maybe more, but the eyes were the same as in the photo. I told her my name. She paused, then said, "You're Rose's granddaughter, aren't you?" We didn't speak inside. She stepped out onto the porch with me, sat down in one of the faded rocking chairs, and looked out over the street like this was just another ordinary Thursday. I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't need to. She told me they had met at a conference in Vermont, that she hadn't known he was married at first, and when she found out, it was too late. She'd fallen in love, and by then he had convinced her that what they had was separate from his family, that love could exist in parallel. I asked if she'd ever met my grandmother. Her lips tightened. She said once, at a bookstore, by accident, and that it had been the most humiliating moment of her life. By the time I got back in the car, I felt less like a detective and more like someone who'd wandered into a graveyard without knowing where they were stepping. This wasn't just a secret. It was a whole other life, one my family had buried while pretending to worship the ground it walked on. And yet somehow, it made everything make more sense. The photo albums that skipped certain months, the trips Grandpa took for work, the emotional vacancy that sometimes clouded Grandma's otherwise picture-perfect holiday monologues. The next morning, I sent a package to Aunt Carla. Inside, I included a copy of the photo, a brief note that said, "You might find this enlightening," and a return address from a made-up name in Charleston. I knew she'd trace it back to me eventually. That wasn't the point. The point was that Carla couldn't keep a secret to save her life. And if anyone could ignite a family meltdown with a single afternoon of loose lips, it was her. I was scheduled to speak at a tech conference that weekend. And during my panel, while I was answering a question about leadership integrity and the intersection of personal ethics and public business, Carla's name popped up on my phone screen no less than 4 times in a row, followed by my mother's, and then Ethan's. I ignored them all. I had a story to finish telling, and it wasn't the one they wanted me to repeat. But later, as I stepped off stage, flushed with adrenaline and the buzz of applause, Carla was waiting near the backstage entrance, her expression a cocktail of fury, confusion, and disbelief. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She marched up, pulled out the photo, and held it up like a badge. "Where did you get this?" she hissed. "Why now?" I smiled. Not cruelly, just tired. Because it's time someone did. And before she could say another word, before she could summon the entire family tribunal or spiral into her favorite game of public confrontation, I walked past her, out into the bright light of a spring afternoon that felt, for the first time in years, like mine. The second billboard was never supposed to go up. It was a contingency plan I had mocked up months earlier, mostly in jest, on one of those nights when Cole and I had stayed too late at the office, high on caffeine and sarcasm, joking about all the ways we'd rebrand ourselves if our company ever tanked or if our families imploded in spectacular fashion, which, now that I thought about it, made the moment less funny and more prophetic. It had sat in a forgotten design folder labeled Nuclear Options, and the file name Sinclair Truth Final V3 JPG was the kind of inside joke that wasn't funny anymore now that I had actually sent it to the printer. It went live on a Tuesday morning at 9:01 a.m., just after the morning rush hour cleared, and stood proudly on the edge of downtown, 3 blocks from the town hall, where half my family sat on various boards and committees, posing as pillars of taste and tradition. The billboard was simple: a photo of Grandma Rose and Grandpa Robert at their 40th anniversary party, smiling in a way that now felt sickeningly rehearsed, with bold white text across the bottom that read, "Legacy is just a lie we tell ourselves to avoid the truth." That one hit harder. The calls started within an hour, but I had already turned off my personal phone, redirected my emails to a burner account, and left my office under the pretense of being off-grid for creative development. In reality, I was in a downtown hotel room, watching from the 13th floor as a small crowd gathered at the base of the billboard, snapping pictures, pointing, and whispering. Someone tagged me in a post on the town Facebook group, something about how Avery Sinclair's gone too far this time. And by noon, a local news blog had picked up the story under the headline, Tech Star Challenges Sinclair Family History with Shocking Public Display. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when I finally glanced at the family group chat out of morbid curiosity, that I realized how deep the damage had cut. There were over 100 unread messages, most of them from Mom, Uncle Frank, and, oddly, Ethan, who had finally decided to grow a backbone now that it involved performative outrage. The messages were a collage of pleading, blame, and outright threats to cut me off from whatever inheritance they still thought I cared about. At the center of it all was Grandma Rose, who hadn't said a word, not once. Her silence hung over everything like smoke after a house fire, the kind of quiet that didn't just suggest hurt, but warned of something much more dangerous brewing beneath the surface. That Friday, despite the swirling chaos and multiple invitations to sit down with the family like adults, I showed up to our weekly Sinclair family livestream dinner, an absurd tradition Ethan had started during the pandemic and insisted we continue every month, as if a Zoom call with cold leftovers and shallow small talk could hold a family together by sheer Wi-Fi strength alone. This time, though, the call wasn't filled with the usual forced cheer. The moment my face appeared in the grid, everything fell silent, like I had walked into a courtroom and not a dinner. Aunt Carla spoke first, her voice cold and clipped, asking me if I was proud of what I'd done. Uncle Frank followed, his tone more theatrical, accusing me of airing private grief for public spectacle. I didn't respond to either. I was watching Grandma, who was sitting in her usual spot at the head of the dining room table, hands folded, face pale, expression unreadable. Then she looked directly into the camera, and for the first time since the first billboard, she spoke. "I should have burned the photos when I had the chance," she said, voice steady, almost eerily calm. "But I didn't, because I thought one day someone would need to know." The room, or rather the screen, went dead silent again. Even Carla stopped mid-interruption, stunned into stillness. Grandma continued, not with anger, but with the weariness of someone who had carried too many truths for too long. She said she had known about the other woman, that she had confronted Grandpa more than once, and that in the end, she had chosen silence not out of weakness, but to preserve a life she had built from scratch with her bare hands and unyielding determination. "We didn't have the luxury of starting over," she said. "We had names to protect, children to raise. You think that's cowardice. I call it survival." I could have said something then. I could have apologized, explained, softened the blow, but instead I leaned forward, elbows on my kitchen counter, and asked her why she hadn't told the truth once he was gone, when no one else could be hurt by it anymore. Her answer was quiet, almost lost in the din of a poor connection, but I heard it clearly. "Because you never just hurt the dead. You hurt everyone they touched." And then, as if on cue, her hand slipped from view and the camera shook slightly. A moment later, she slumped forward, her head hitting the table with a dull, heavy sound that sent a wave of horrified gasps through every square on that screen. Ethan yelled her name. Mom screamed. Uncle Frank jumped up, knocking over a chair, his screen turning sideways in the chaos. I sat frozen, staring at my grandmother's unmoving form, while the silence came rushing back. Not smoke this time, but something colder, more final. The call ended abruptly. Someone must have closed the laptop or disconnected the feed. I sat alone in my apartment for hours afterward, the light from the billboard casting long shadows through the window, watching my reflection in the dark glass and wondering, not for the first time, if I had taken it all too far, if truth really had a limit, and if I had just reached it without realizing the cost. But deep down, beneath the guilt and fear and grief that now pulsed in waves I couldn't stop, I also knew this. Grandma Rose may have collapsed, but the truth was already standing, and it wasn't going anywhere. The hospital waiting room smelled like disinfectant and overbrewed coffee, a combination that seemed to seep into the very pores of the leather chairs and the sterile tile floor. And as I sat beneath the flickering fluorescent light that buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that made people look up every few seconds without knowing why, I felt for the first time in years like a child again, like the girl who used to hide under the dining table during grown-up arguments, who watched the performance of adulthood with a cautious, silent skepticism, and who never quite believed the smiling photos meant what they were supposed to. Grandma Rose had been stabilized. That much I had gathered from the nurse who called Mom, who then called me out of obligation, not warmth. But no one really knew how bad it had been, only that she'd collapsed mid-sentence during a virtual dinner meant to restore harmony, and instead exposed the thin, trembling seams of a family that had spent decades pretending it was sewn from stronger thread. Mom didn't say it outright, but her voice carried the unspoken accusation that I had caused it, that my need to peel back layers, to publicize what had once only been whispered behind closed doors, had finally pushed Grandma past a threshold she wasn't meant to cross. And maybe they were right. Maybe I had opened wounds she'd been content to leave scarred over. But as I watched the minutes tick by on the analog clock above the nurse's station, I couldn't stop thinking about the look on Grandma's face just before she collapsed. Not anger, not sorrow, but a kind of release, like she had finally handed off a burden she'd carried for too long and had allowed herself, at last, to stop pretending she could hold it all together for us. When the nurse finally called my name, she led me through a narrow corridor and into a quiet room where Grandma lay, her skin pale against the stiff hospital bedding, her hair still perfectly pinned, defying the chaos around her. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing was steady, and I sat in the chair beside her without saying anything, because sometimes silence tells the truth better than words ever could. I reached into my coat and pulled out the photo, that photo, the one that started it all, the one of Grandpa and the other woman, and placed it gently on the bedside table, not as a threat, not as a weapon, but as a quiet offering of honesty between us. She opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from something deeper than sleep, and when she saw me, she didn't smile or scowl. She just looked, her gaze sharp and aware, and I realized then that even now, even here, Grandma Rose was never going to be the type to break down in front of anyone, least of all her granddaughter. "I saw your billboard," she said, her voice raspy but strong. And before I could explain, before I could offer some version of an apology or justification, she continued, "I think your grandfather would have hated it, but he would have understood." I didn't know what to say to that, because for all the grief and anger I had carried over the past few weeks, the idea that he might have understood stopped me cold, like someone had thrown ice water down my back. She reached for the photo, held it between her fingers like something fragile, and then let out a small laugh. Not bitter, not mocking, but something in between resignation and relief. "He loved her, you know," she said, in his way. "But he never stopped loving me either. That's the part no one ever tells you about betrayal. It doesn't cancel the love, it just changes it." I asked her why she stayed, why she never told anyone, why she let the family myth grow so thick around us that it smothered the truth. She looked at me like I'd asked why the sky is blue, like I still didn't understand how the world worked. "Because you don't protect a marriage for yourself," she said. "You protect it for the people who need to believe in it." She paused, then added, "You've always needed to tear things down to see what's underneath. I needed to build something, even if it wasn't all real." We sat in silence for a while after that. Two women from the same bloodline, shaped by different eras but bound by the same impossible expectations. When the nurse came back in to check her vitals, I stood to leave, but before I reached the door, Grandma said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Do what you need to do, Avery. Just don't lose yourself doing it." That night, I drove home through the back roads, the long winding lanes that curved around our old church and past the Sinclair family cemetery, and when I got home, I didn't sleep. Instead, I made one final call to the Billboard company and had the downtown sign replaced with a plain white background and one sentence in black serif font. She told me everything. I chose peace. No signature, no logo, no photo, just that. The next morning, the calls slowed. The messages trickled into silence. Aunt Carla had nothing left to say. Ethan deleted his performative outrage posts, and for once, the Sinclair family calendar stayed empty. I visited Grandma one more time before she was discharged, and we didn't speak about the billboard, the collapse, or Grandpa. We talked about peaches, how she used to pick them in Georgia with her sister, and about the time she got kicked out of a library for laughing too loud. I brought her a bag of the sugar cookies she used to make when I was little, the ones she claimed were from a secret recipe, but were clearly just Pillsbury with extra vanilla. When I left, she squeezed my hand and said, "You were always the brave one. Just make sure you don't become the bitter one." The billboard stayed up for a week before I had it taken down. Now there's just an empty frame, a blank canvas where a lie once lived, and then, briefly, the truth. People drive past it and barely notice, just another piece of forgotten advertising space. But sometimes I park nearby and sit with the windows down, just listening, because the truth doesn't echo loudly forever. Sometimes it just hangs in the air, quiet, undeniable, and waiting for whoever's ready to hear it.